Can I acknowledge we are on the lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people? I've got to make special acknowledgement to the Whadjuk people because my two daughters have grown up on their country, and they're Gungaloo women from central Queensland, and it's been a really great experience for them to be allowed to grow up on Noongar country. And I'd like all of you to think about, when you do acknowledgement to country, to actually think about where you live and acknowledge that country. So it's a good exercise to go out and find out, if you're living in the Perth area, find out about the Whadjuk people, and when you do acknowledgement, do that, because it's really important and it builds this good relationship with the people you're talking to. The acknowledgement is really important. It sort of sets this relationship, and when I think about the acknowledgement, it's basically the only cultural protocol we have here in Australia. You think about it. What other cultural protocols do we have when we welcome dignitaries or anything? There's some guy, or generally a guy, making a speech of welcome, but we don't have cultural stuff. And years ago, I was doing work on the constitutional recognition, and I went to Mutijulu, the community at the base of Uluru, and the elders there told us a whole lot of stuff. We had to explain the Constitution as this is the big law for Australia that people in Canberra use to make little laws. And they said, oh yeah, we get that because we got big law here, it's called our culture. And we make little laws out of that, like who can marry who can be responsible for a sacred site or a particular ceremony. So we get that. And they said, we asked them, would it be a good thing for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people to be recognised in the Constitution? And if ever you go to these communities, particularly the old ladies, they sort of like they're having a massive blue, but they're just debating. It's loud and it gets emotional, but they're just debating. So I had this big debate, the women, they come back and said, look, you got to take this message. And the message is, if them people are going to live here on our country, they've got to understand our culture and respect our culture. And I thought that was pretty cool. Then they had another debate. They decided to go away and have another debate, and they came back and it was pretty profound what they said to us, a message I had to take back to the expert panel, and therefore, and it's become a bit of a mantra of mine now. And they said, if those people are going to live here, they've got to understand it's their culture. They can't live here on this country and not be part of this culture. So when I tell people, when you see our mob get up and dance and do ceremony, I want you to think about, challenge yourself about it not being some exotic people who've come along to entertain you. This is your culture as Australians. I reckon that's a really big challenge, to just have that, flip that mindset that this is your culture. And I'm happy to take that message, because it was the elders from the Mutijulu people who told us to give this message. So I sort of reckon if we had a culture based on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, with the first arrivals, the English, the Irish, the Scottish, the Welsh, then we looked at the next wave of arrivals, probably post-war, with the Eastern European people, the Italians. The first boat people came in, well, the second boat people came in the 80s, the Vietnamese people. And now we've got new arrivals. And I reckon if you mixed all that up in a big mixer, we'd end up with an Australian culture that's based on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture. And it leads me to this part that I want to talk a little bit about, and that's a relationship. Helen talked about relationships. I want to talk about the big relationship between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and the rest of the population. And it's been a defining part of the Australian story, but it's part of the story we haven't resolved yet. And unless we resolve it, all the programs, all the money in the world will only touch the surface. And it's the position we occupy as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia. And if you look at colonisation and how the British came and claimed Australia, at that time there were things like the doctrine of discovery that was developed by the Vatican. In America they called it manifest destiny. There was always manifest destiny that people were going to come here and take over from the Native Americans. It was either by conquest, it was by agreement, or if the land was empty. And if you look at colonisers around the world, they used to go into a country and they'd see a king, a queen, a chief, a Raj in India, and they'd negotiate. But they couldn't do it here in Australia because we don't have those structures. We actually have elders and we work on consensus. And this is my voodoo history and probably a bit of psychology thrown in that says they couldn't cope with that, so they just basically said Aboriginal people haven't even developed enough to have a hierarchy because we can't deal with them. And then they just dismissed us because they couldn't deal with us. And they just assumed the land was empty. Now, that was overturned in 1992 with the High Court decision on native title, Mabo. It was so important, that decision. I think it could have been the first step in proper reconciliation, but look at the outcry it caused. But nearly 28 years, 27 years down the track, it's now becoming part of the fabric of Australia. It's not. I remember when the Nyungar decision came down all those years ago, there wasn't a great outcry. I remember West Australians running a campaign against national land rights with black hands reaching into people's backyards. That didn't happen when the Nyungar decision came down. So I think it's this evolution of things going ahead. And I said yesterday, in the back of people's minds, there's this little voice that reminds them that people were here. And to avoid that voice, in my view, this is where the voodoo psychology comes in, is that they dismiss it by dehumanising us. They didn't even develop enough to have leaders. They were Stone Age people. Or they demonise us by saying they're drunk, dirty and degenerate, so we don't really have to take any notice of them. There's an old saying, the truth will liberate you, and I think the truth will liberate non-Indigenous Australians more than Indigenous Australians, because I think it'll be free to establish this relationship that's going to be so important, where people are valued. It's so important that we establish that relationship. Because you can't... I've worked all over Australia. I've worked in the Human Rights Commission. I'm lucky enough to have done a Royal Commission. It's relationships that make changes. You can put all the programs and dollars and cents and commitments. Unless people have good relationships, you will only end up with something that'll battle on for a while, but it'll never produce sustainable results. So relationships are really, really important, and I think we've got to get past that point. I want to acknowledge Helen. Like I said, not everyone gets to sit on a Royal Commission, and we were on Royal Commissions concurrently. Except Helen's went for 5 years, ours went for 15 months. And I was traumatised at the end of 15 months, and I just admire Helen for her perseverance, her commitment on that Royal Commission, telling stories that this country needs to know. So can we thank Helen for the work she did on the Royal Commission. I want to go through a few things, and I'll come back to relationships. We got asked a lot when Margaret and I started. Margaret White, Supreme Court judge in Queensland. We were both commissioners. Helen had 4 other fellow commissioners. And we got asked, what do we do? What difference is our Royal Commission going to make? And our senior counsel, Peter Culligan, came up with this at the opening of our hearings. I'm not going to read this stuff to you because I'm going to assume everyone in the room can read. But think about it. People hold inquiries as a substitute for action because it makes it look good. Margaret said to us, and she's a Supreme Court judge, let's follow the evidence. And the evidence showed us we had to go right in to look at almost a review of what was happening in Northern Territory society, particularly around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And the intervention, we found the top-down approach doesn't work. For all the trauma and drama and hurt that the intervention caused in the Northern Territory, and I was living in the Northern Territory at that time, I can tell you it's regressed completely back to where it was before the intervention started, after billions of dollars being spent. And yesterday I gave an example of how much resources government has to do this thing, is that you couldn't buy a Toyota Land Cruiser in the Northern Territory for about 2 years because the government had bought them all for 2 years. We also found when you get consumers involved in whatever program or service you want to provide, you end up with better results. That's around the world, whether it's in Aboriginal affairs, whether it's McDonald's changing their menu or whatever, you get consumers involved. So we know this. And we know that the more evidence people more control people have over their lives, the better conditions will be for them in their communities. But the opposite's also true. It's probably more true than the first bit. When you take agency and control and people are disempowered, you can almost guarantee dysfunction and trauma will follow, and in great amounts. I said about, we wrote these two this slide and the next slide. And I said yesterday, now that we know that Scott Morrison's the PM, I guarantee you, I want you to think about this and think about me when you hear this, that he's going to come out and say we're going to reset the relationship with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And we're going to do things with them instead of things to them and things for them. And then they'll start doing things to us and for us again. And what we said there, and it's the last sentence in that second paragraph, how we go around in circles, and the circularity is caused in our communities cynicism and fatigue, and we're all tired. We looked at measurement of outcomes. This is going to make sense shortly. And there's so many programs going into our communities, you cannot attribute the result of one program to a particular outcome. Because in our communities, there's this multiplicity of programs that go in and try to do a whole range of things. So when we talk to economists and epidemiologists about how you measure things, they said, you can't. It's really hard to attribute one result to a particular intervention because there's so many of them. Funding. One of the benefits of being on a Royal Commission, you've got lots of power. You can force people to come and give evidence. You can force people to provide information. We do these things called notices to produce, and they carry a fairly heavy weight of the law. So we sent a notice to produce to the federal government to tell us about how much money is spent in the Northern Territory on children's stuff. And this is the results we got back. They couldn't tell us. The government can't tell us how much money they spend. And if they can't tell us how much money they spend, they can't tell us the results. They can't tell us how it's distributed. And not only did we find duplication between levels of government, so the territory and the federal government, we found duplication within levels of government. And we even found duplication within the same agencies. Two parts of the same agency doing the same thing, but no one knows what's happening. I want to talk a bit about tendering, because this is I like to talk about the relationship, and I like to talk about programs, and Helen's talked about overfunding. This is what we've got to get to, because this is where the rubber hits the road. It's how government resources things, and they do this thing called tendering. Now, I've done a lot of work around tendering, and I've done a lot of work around grants. In the Aboriginal Affairs area, they're not tenders to our communities, because if they were tenders, like they tendered to Price Waterhouse or Lend-Lease to build something, they'd give them the money and they'd produce a result, and that's the end of it. Our organisations are policed almost out of existence about financial management. So it's not tendering, it's a grant process. And instead of getting the best of a tender process and the best of a grant process, we end up with worse of both of them. So we've got to think, and one of the messages I will be giving to government at all levels, you've got to get away from this tendering for services. And there's a good reason for it. I'll go to the next slide and I'll come back to that one. These are complex human problems. Try to think about how you would write a tender to address family violence, where you've got to look after, you've got to intervene and make people, and particularly children, safe. You've got to work with the community, and then you've got to work with perpetrators. How do you write a contract for that? It's complex. It can only be place-based. It can only be designed by people on the ground who are experiencing this stuff every day and articulating what they need. And the evidence showed us that these complex, you get poorer results when you try to itemise the stuff. And if I can go back to that last slide, these complex human problems aren't like blood tests that you can itemise, standardise and have a price per unit. So think about how you do that, and that's what they're trying to do, squeeze all that stuff into a process they can understand as tendering, and it doesn't work. The answers, it's something like this. We came up with the place-based, practice-informed approach, where you go out, and we talk about place-based all the time. We didn't really know what the community wanted. So our description of place-based is that you actually go to the community and you get the community to decide the place. Is it going to be something in the Northern Territory like the Walpri Triangle, or in WA, the Kimberley versus the Pilbara? It'll be something that people will come up with about how they identified, and I'll guarantee it's generally identification around culture. This is us mob, this is them. So we want the mob to decide what the place is. And then this comes back to relationships. Every place has all these differences. And years ago I was asked, what's the problem in Aboriginal affairs? And I said, look, there's lots of ways I can describe this, but I'll try 3 ways. One is governments say you can't throw money at this problem, then they throw money at it. Tell you. You want to see the money washing around in the Northern Territory for Aboriginal affairs. They say we can't have a blanket approach to things because we understand everything's different. Then they impose a blanket approach like income management, like we've done in Kununurra with the healthy welfare card. We're treating everyone in Kununurra the same, as if they're all useless and hopeless and can't manage their money. So we'll just impose that on people, the people who are doing good, bad or indifferent. And then they finally say, Aboriginal people have got to take responsibility. They've really got to step up to the plate. Then everything that we need to step up to the plate with is taken away from us, our agency. We make rules that make it hard for our families to take control. The income management, again, is a typical one. I can't think of a greater way to create dependency than to manage people's money. So they try to roll out programs. We've actually got this program where you've just got to roll it out everywhere. But you can't do that with these complex human issues. You just cannot do that. And this is why I worked at fairly senior levels in government and outside government. My thesis is this about policy. You've got to create policy at a national level that you can drive trucks through. They're so wide, so you can actually interpret in the community. You allow the community to interpret what they want. And an example of that, I helped design a family violence policy for ATSIC back in the day. And Amanda Vanstone was a minister, and she called me over and said, Mick, we want to put in there that we want a women's shelter in every community. And we said, we're not going to do that. And she thought we were opposed to women's shelters, but we'd already got information that women's shelters live in places like Perth. They're de-identified and anonymous in a suburb. It sort of doesn't work in a community of 200 people where the men just go down and surround the house and throw rocks. So instead of saying we'll have women's shelters, we said we will make women and children safe and secure. And if a community wants a women's shelter, they certainly can have a women's shelter, but we're not going to force it on them. So you've got to, people at the national level cannot create, and I reckon the state level cannot create prescriptive or descriptive policy that goes down to the nth degree, because you just don't give communities the capacity to do what they want to do. So this rollout of uniform policies has got to stop. I'll run through these pretty quick, you'll just read them. We need a shared vision. We need people to get together to start developing what they want in a community. And yesterday we saw people just putting their hands up saying we want to be part of that. A place-based approach, like I said, accepting there are going to be inevitable differences between what one mob want compared to another. I love finding new words, and I got this one from the Royal Commission, subsidiarity. I love it. I throw it into conversations every now and then. Everyone thinks I'm really intelligent. It means you make decisions at the lowest possible level. You go down to a community, you might go to a family. That's where decisions should be made if you're going to make really good decisions. And the scary part in all this is this top one. Governments will sort of commit to say, oh yeah, we'll give the blacks a say out there. They don't really mean it, but they sort of agree with that. But the minute you say, we want bureaucrats out there who are going to make decisions locally as well. When I was a regional manager in ATSIC, in a little town where I grew up, in Rockhampton, I had a delegation of $2 million. I could sign off on a project for $2 million. I don't think you'll find anyone out in the region now can sign off on $10,000. So if you've got a community on one side making decisions about what their priorities are, and you've got a bureaucracy on the other side making decisions in Canberra or Perth, there's going to be a natural disconnect. So, but see, that's a scary thing for governments, to actually let go of centralised power, even to their own people out in regional places. We need different accountability frameworks, like I said before. You can't measure, you can't attribute outcomes to a particular intervention because there's so many of them. We need to actually resolve that. I won't go too much into this except to say the last one. This is a really important one because no one funds it. No one funds the governance of a community or a community organisation. They'll fund services, but they won't fund. And this is the oil that keeps everything rolling, how people relate to each other. You won't find a treasury anywhere in Australia will say we'll fund that stuff. We won't fund a consultation process. We fund services. We do zero-based budgeting, and you put a budget in that tells me the services you're going to provide, and we'll make a decision. If you put something like this in, they'll say no. And I think what you've got to get to is doing... I'm going to run through this because I've got 39 seconds left. I might go over a little bit, a couple of minutes, because I really want to talk about what I'm doing down in Bourke, and well, not what I'm doing, what the Bourke community is doing in northern New South Wales and western New South Wales. About 5 years ago, I got invited to go out there. the Sydney Morning Herald called it the most criminal town in the world at that time, because anything up to 20-30% of men could be incarcerated from Bourke at any one time. And so I went out there and we started to talk about justice reinvestment. Now, I think justice reinvestment has now become almost what I call a polished narrative. Anything you want to do in justice, I say justice reinvestment. What they miss, everyone, is the reinvestment bit. So Bourke, we've actually done a lot of data. We know how much it costs to incarcerate people out of Bourke, and when they start working on it, the government's agreed in New South Wales, say it's $1 million and they reduce it by 10%, we want that $100,000 reinvested back in Bourke. We don't want to lose it. Bourke, the big investment they make in Bourke is a town the size of Bourke would probably have 15 police officers. There's 56 in Bourke. So if we actually measured how much those police officers cost in Bourke, I think we're now getting into the tens of millions. So it's funny, I told that to one of my mates, Ian Anderson, like Helen, one of our first doctors, and he said, geez, Bourke must be the safest place in Australia. They've got that many police. But it ain't. So we've worked for 5 years. We did 18 months of just consultation of the community, not consultation, of the community working to get their act together. They worked out, they're like most communities, and they fight a lot. So they spent 18 months just getting to know each other. My job was, as an outsider, was an independent chair of meetings. That's all I did. The big thing in doing this, I said this morning, the two big things. One is resources. So you can always get more resources, but see, there's only ever going to be 24 hours in every day. You can't extend that. So time is a cost. And we've got to get used to that it takes time to establish relationships. You know, we have those 12-month funding cycles, and if you don't spend it, you're going to lose it. This is the reforms we've got to actually start articulating in government to make this work. That you can actually have multiple projects. And don't ever let the government tell you they can't do that. I ran a cooperative research centre where we used to get 7 years worth of funding up front. So they have programs that do this. Don't ever believe governments can't do this. They can. But they got to about this bit about how NGOs come into their communities. And they wanted to establish principles for Bourke. So the principles are these. This is what I want to finally share with you. If you're an NGO, you're coming into communities, have a look at these principles. You've got to be culturally competent and culturally secure in Bourke. We don't want you to be culturally competent in North Queensland and think you can come into Bourke and do the same thing, because you're not. This is a different country. You've got to build the capacity of the local Bourke community. You've got to have an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander employment strategy that's centred in Bourke, not in Perth or Sydney or Melbourne if you're Red Cross. You've got to be responsible to the local Aboriginal community. Don't think you're just going to go to government, get a whole heap of money and come in and deliver services to us. That's not going to happen. You can't duplicate, and you've got to coordinate, because they're sick of all these things happening where people just come in and out of their community. And the last one that I really love is this. When are you going to leave? And we want to talk to you about that up front. And what are you going to leave behind when you go? And they're very serious about that. They actually, now, because they're really strong as a community, and they're not 100%, you won't find 100% of people in Bourke agree with this, but you'll find a big majority who do. And they make these agencies responsible for what they're doing. And to give you an example, the other thing Bourke does, and you've got to do this, you've got to actually have lots of data. So we took 2 years to get all the data out of the government. And the one thing we found, it was around offending, and it was particularly youth offending, was that 61% of offending occurred between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m, and 48% of offending occurred on weekends. And guess when the youth services weren't working? So their form of empowerment was not to set up their own youth service, but to go to the 3 youth services working in Bourke at the time and said, either you start opening your doors till 10 with a plan to open till midnight, or we'll just go to government and tell them we don't want you here. And they've set up relationships to make sure that can happen. So ladies and gentlemen, it's about relationships. It's about the big relationship. We all have a responsibility there. We have a relationship to let go and give people some authority in their communities. And we've got to trust them, because our mob, I have so much trust in our people that given the right circumstances, they will make the right decisions. And we've got to trust people to do that. And if I was all the white people out there in communities, and there are, down the southwest and all that, I'd start looking at the Aboriginal mob and say, well, if they've got that, we want it. Because when we're doing native title here, right back at the beginning of the land claim, I went and met 16 shires, and they wanted to know what I was doing there, because I came from Atsic. Was I there just to keep an eye on them? I told them about our relationship with the Gallup government, and they wanted me to go down and work with them because they want the same relationship. So think about trust, think about letting go. Think about being fair dinkum about an exit plan if you work for an NGO. Not that we don't appreciate you, but you're not going to be there forever. Thank you.